All right, hi everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Introduction to Qgrid. Qgrid is a scrollable grid widget for exploring data frames and is now available for use in Quantopian's hosted research environment. Qgrid allows you to sort, filter, and edit the contents of your data frames using an intuitive point-and-click interface. Today's speaker is Tim Shawver. He is a senior software engineer at Quantopian, and he created the first version of Qgrid back in 2014. In addition to maintaining Qgrid over the years, Tim added the ability to share notebooks to the Quantopian forums and also did the front-end work to integrate the Jupiter Notebook interface into the Quantopian website. Tim attended Tufts University where he studied computer science. Thanks, Tim.
Thanks, Paige, and thanks everyone for joining today. I'm really excited to talk about Qgrid, which is a project that is near and dear to my heart. And before we get started, I just wanted to say nothing that I present today is investment advice in any way. Just have to include that disclaimer. Okay, so the title of this talk is Introduction to Qgrid. I'm Tim Shawver, and I have some contact information up here in case you want to get in touch with me after the presentation. So the goals for this talk are to answer the questions that I have listed here, namely, what is Qgrid? Why did we build it, and why are we still working on it? What can Qgrid do, and what can I use it for? And what's next for Qgrid? And at that point, we'll talk a little bit about different ideas that we have for enhancements to Qgrid. And so the strategy for achieving these goals is going to be kind of going through this outline. I'm going to start with a demo of Qgrid to kind of show you what it is. I think the easiest way to understand what Qgrid is to see it in action. But that demo will mainly focus on the use case that we had in mind for Qgrid when we originally built it. So we'll focus on kind of the more basic use case. And then after that, I'll get into the development timeline, so you have some historical context for the project, and then I'll get into some of the recent versions, specifically 1.0, 1.1.1, and then we'll do another demo where I show you some of the new capabilities that became available in 1.0 and beyond. Okay, so let's jump over to a demo real quick. So this demo is going to be run on Quantopian. We fairly recently made Qgrid available on Quantopian for the first time. And what you're looking at here is a notebook that I shared on the forums when we first made Qgrid available on Quantopian. And I'm going to jump around in this notebook a little bit to give you an overview. So you can see at the top here, there's kind of maybe some handy descriptions of how to use Qgrid. But for now, I'm going to jump down into example 2. And what we have here, what this example shows you is all the different types of data or all the different types of columns that Qgrid supports. So to start, I'm going to render a data frame using the static HTML table that comes with Jupyter Notebook and Pandas. So this is your static HTML table, and this is rendering your data frame without Qgrid. Kind of the easiest way to understand what Qgrid is, I think, is it's an interactive and scrollable replacement for this static HTML table. And I want one caveat when I say replacement is that it doesn't have all of the features that that a static HTML table has, such as it's missing some styling features and such. But on the other hand, it has it does a bunch of things that the static HTML table doesn't do. So anyways, we have the static HTML table. So now let's render it as a Qgrid. And to do that, you call Qgrid.ShowGrid, and you pass in your data frame, and then you can also pass in some options. In this case, we're saying we want to show the toolbar. So as you can see, we have a nice interactive table, and this is sortable. So I'm going to just play around with sorting a little bit. You can see that all these different types of columns are sortable. It's also filterable. So I can pick a specific date range, can reset my filter. We can filter numerical columns. We can filter categorical columns. And then in addition to sorting and filtering, you can also edit any of these types of columns. So I can say, all right, maybe this value was wrong, and I want to change it to something else. And a cool thing you can do is you can get your data frame back after making some changes to it. So using that would be using the GetChangedDF function, and you call that on to the widget object that gets returned by the ShowGrid function. So when you call ShowGrid, if you store a reference to that widget, then you can do stuff with it after after the widget's been shown. So in this case, I can say GetChangedDF, and if I look in here, I can see that sure enough, my edit did actually take effect. The other thing I can do is, the other thing about GetChangedDF that makes it useful is it reflects any sorts or filters that you have applied. So if let's say I apply a numerical filter again, and I sort by this column, and then I run this again, you can see that now we're seeing the same number of rows, we're seeing them in the same order, and we're still seeing the edits that we made. So I think the key takeaway here is, well, at this point, I just want to say there are kind of two categories of users that can benefit from this functionality. It might be obvious that this could be very useful to people who don't know pandas, and a lot of times people are asked to work in Jupyter notebooks that don't know pandas. But even for people that do know pandas, this lessens the mental workload of having to explore your data frame. Okay, so let's move on to one more example here, just really quickly. The first example that I showed you didn't show scrolling at all, and I want to show you that because Qgrid has like an infinite scrolling capability, I guess you could call it, or a dynamic scrolling capability where it loads rows of the data frame from the server dynamically as you scroll. So what I've just done is I just created a data frame with some random numbers that's 1,000,000 rows long, and then I made one of the columns a string column, just so we can see the performance of a string column. But anyways, this data frame is now showing 1,000,000 rows, and as you can see, I can still scroll through this just as quickly as I could normally. So you're scrolling through all 1,000,000 rows, which is pretty nifty. And the other thing I would point out is that all the operations in this table are still performant, and that's because each of these actions that we're taking is being sent up to the notebook server, and it's behind the scenes we're doing these sorts and filters using pandas. So it should be just as fast as if you wrote pandas code yourself. So as you can see, I'm filtering by this numerical column, and it's instantaneously updating the grid. And one other thing I'd point out is that, so the reason I added this string column is to show you that even when, so these are actually, they look like numbers, but they've been converted to strings. Even when you have a column with 1,000,000 unique string values and you open up this filter control, the table doesn't slow down at all. You can still scroll through all 1,000,000 values of the column because this table works in a similar manner to the table itself. And by this table, I mean the table in the filter dropdown works just like the Qgrid instance in that it's loading rows dynamically as you scroll. So, so yeah, I mentioned already that this is useful to people that don't know pandas, but it's also provides some new capabilities to people that do know pandas. For example, you've never before, I imagine, been able to scan through rows like this using a scroll bar, which may not seem like a big deal, but it actually can let you get to know your data better than you did in the past. So to kind of hammer that point home, I'm going to go through kind of a more real-world example. These were both, so far we've just been looking at dummy data. So now I'm going to go through an example that uses some Quantopian data. So at the top of this notebook, we already have a pipeline that we set up that's getting pricing data for Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, and Tesla. And I've already run that pipeline in the interest of time. And that's this information here. And then in the second example, in the example 1B here, we're adding some additional columns to that pipeline that we set up in the first example. So in particular, we're adding sentiment score and message volume from StockTwits. And StockTwits is a third-party data provider that we make available on Quantopian through the pipeline API. So now, so as you can see here, there in the data frame we're seeing nans for message volume and sentiment, and that's because the date I specifically picked a date range that actually starts before the StockTwits data became available. And the reason for doing that is kind of the scenario that I want to simulate here is, imagine you're thinking of using StockTwits data in a research notebook or in an algorithm, and you want to know what happens at the boundaries of that data. Specifically, when do I start getting valid data for all of my stocks? So, and Qgrid can help you find that. So, to start, I want to point out that this is actually, if we go to the documentation for StockTwits, the time span of the data is actually listed here, but let's just double check using Qgrid to make sure that it has data for all of the stocks that we're interested in. So we already have our data frame here, and now this is the static HTML view, so now let's look at it using Qgrid. And you can see we have nans here, and but what we're interested in is what's the point at which the nans start being populated. Specifically, the message volume column and the sentiment column start being populated. So if I hit the full screen button here, you can see Qgrid in a larger view, and we know from the documentation that we think the data started being available in July 9th, 2009, and the date range that I'm looking at is from 2009 to 2011, so it's probably about a quarter of the way through. And you can see, if you scroll down, you can see, okay, now we're starting to see some values for some of the names, but not for all of them. So you can see Apple has a value here, but Microsoft and Amazon don't have values yet. And if you just scroll, you can actually just find the point in your data at which all of these names are available. So if you can imagine, if you're doing some analysis in your notebook on this data, this would be a handy tool for you to understand, okay, what date range should I be focused on? So that's kind of like one use case is the fact that you're able to scan rows in a way that you never could before. Now, another interesting thing to point out here is you'll notice that Tesla is not listed in each of these groups. And but if we scroll to the end, we see that Tesla's here. So and the reason for that is because Tesla actually wasn't public at the beginning of this date range. So let's say I want to know, okay, when did Tesla become available for me to look at in my analysis? So what I can do is I can just easily filter down to Tesla, and I can sort by date here, and we can see that the first date that we have data for Tesla is June 30th. But interestingly, we don't have returns or market cap for Tesla on that date. So this is the first date that Tesla started trading. And for whatever reason, we don't have returns or market cap yet. So that's just an interesting peculiarity of the data that happens at the boundaries of where the data begins. And maybe, probably, if you didn't have a tool like Qgrid, or you weren't really good with pandas, the point at which you find out about these peculiarities would be when you start running code and start generating charts and stuff, and you get confused about, you know, why things don't look right. So I think that was what I wanted to cover on the introductory demo. That took a bit longer than I expected. So I'm going to now jump back to the slides and kind of give you a bit more historical context for the project, and then I'm going to jump back into a demo. All right, so let me present again. So the introductory demo is done. Okay, so the timeline for Qgrid is actually pretty long because it started a long time ago, and then there were some lulls in development. And I'm kind of breaking up the timeline into 4 different phases. So the initial development, I say, is the first couple years. And the way the project started is I was asked to add a transactions and positions table to the old version of the Quantopian IDE. And the way that I went about doing that was I noticed that it would be useful to have a control where each of the filters, or where we could automatically have filters for various columns based on the types of data being shown in those columns. And so I added this capability to a third-party JavaScript library called SlickGrid, and we used that in the IDE. And then I showed it to the team, and my good friend Scott Sanderson suggested, hey, that seems like it could work really well with pandas. And I think kind of the connection that he made was that pandas has type information specified with each column, and I had built a control that could generate filters based on the types of data in each column. So that was kind of like the key realization that there was maybe something useful here. And he suggested this might be a good first project for me to learn about the Jupyter environment, because I was going to be working on the research environment, which was all Jupyter based. So anyways, I took his advice and I thought it was a good idea, and we released the first version in October 2014. That was, you know, pretty bare bones at that time, not a lot of configurability. And then I'm just going to point out some kind of key contributions from the community. Tobias Brandt worked with Scott to allow specifying options and grid options, and that was in September 2014. So that was a big contribution to allow some additional configurability. And then actually, sorry, Tobias Brandt's supposed to be September 2015. And then Steven Sylvester added the ability to edit, add and remove rows, which was a big deal. But anyways, so that was kind of like the initial phase of the project. And then I call this next phase Into the Abyss, because it was a point at which it wasn't really clear what was going to happen to Qgrid, because I didn't really know if I wanted to keep working on it, because it was taking up a lot of my time, and it wasn't really clear that it had a lot of potential, or I wasn't sure that it had a lot of potential at that point. So anyways, I started feeling guilty basically about not maintaining the project as well as I would have liked to, and I updated the README saying Quantopian engineers are not doing any more forward development. And that actually made a lot of people think that the project was dead, which was in a way kind of true, because I wasn't totally sure if it was going to continue. And then something happens in June of 2017. Qgrid we found out that Qgrid was uncompatible with the new version of IPy widgets. And at that point, I was faced with the decision of, do I upgrade Qgrid to be compatible, or do I stop working on the project, basically? And because I think the project was going to die if we didn't keep it compatible with IPy widgets, because that's the framework that's built on. So I started working on that, and as I was working on it, I found out about this widget cookie cutter project that gave some guidance on the best practices for widget development. And then I also learned about the new version of IPy widgets that was going to be coming out. And one of the things I learned about is that with the new version of IPy widgets, Qgrid would be able to work on JupyterLab. And that got me really excited and sort of got me reinterested in the project, because I realized that some of the functionality that I had in mind for Qgrid would work really well in JupyterLab. So anyways, at that point, in June 2017, I started working on Qgrid 1.0, which was going to be a major refactoring that made Qgrid compatible with IPy widgets, and also moved a lot of the sorting and filtering processing from the JavaScript browser to the server to enable a bunch of new capabilities, which I'll get into in the next section. So Qgrid 1.0 was finally released in January of 2018. And then this is sort of like the final phase of the project that's still ongoing, which is getting Qgrid available on Quantopian, which is something we had been wanting to do forever. And now that Qgrid is kind of a more significant project, and it's growing in popularity, we could finally justify putting it on Quantopian. And also, I just wanted to mention we got a nice contribution from Abigail Hahn, who added column options, which basically allows you to configure the grid at a more granular level than before. Previously, you can only specify options for the whole grid, and now you can do it for specific columns. And she added a bunch of other stuff too. Oops. So I want to keep going in the presentation. Okay, so just a quick kind of conceptual note, or high-level point here, is that I think what makes Qgrid different from other spreadsheet applications is where it lives, so to speak. And by that I mean basically what the title of this slide says. It gets its power from what it depends on, and that's Jupyter and Pandas. Because when you're in the Jupyter Notebook, you have the ability to use all your favorite Python data science tools. You can switch back and forth between using GUI tools and using Python code. And also you have another machine at your disposal, because you're connecting to a notebook server, which doesn't necessarily have to be on the same machine where you're using the browser. And then we weren't fully taking advantage of these capabilities until Qgrid 1.0, which I'll get into in the upcoming slides. And then just while I'm talking about how great the platform is, just want to say thanks to the Jupyter community, specifically people who have worked on IPy widgets like Jason Grout and Sylvan Corley. Okay, so this section is just going to kind of show you what changed in Qgrid 1.0, which kind of unlocked a whole bunch of new capabilities. And this is kind of, I realize it's kind of a silly cartoon, but hopefully it will kind of give you an idea of what changed. So on the left is you, and you're looking, in the middle is the web browser that you're using, and inside the web browser is the blue circle is the Qgrid icon. So what this is showing is that like you're using Qgrid in your web browser, and then on the right is your notebook server, which has the data that that you want to display. So before Qgrid 1.0, kind of the way this would work is you would type into your web browser a ShowGrid command, and then that gets passed on to the Jupyter Notebook server. The notebook server sends back the JSON rows that Qgrid needs to display. And the way it used to work before 1.0 is that at this point we would send all of the rows back down to the browser. And there are some scalability, as you can imagine, there are some scalability issues with that because the web browser is not designed to handle large sets of data. And once the rows are sent down to the browser, all the scrolling, sorting, and filtering actions that you take in the browser are handled within the browser, and there's no messages being sent back up to the notebook server. Now let's look at what happens in Qgrid 1.0. So again, you call ShowGrid. Again, JSON rows are sent down, but now we're only sending the rows that are visible in the grid. And then scrolling, sorting, and filtering, when you take those actions in the browser, those get sent back up to the notebook server. And there's ends up being kind of a cycle here where when you scroll or sort, then some new JSON rows get sent down to the browser and redisplayed. And so this is kind of how it works, but how I want it to feel is this. It should sort of feel like you're looking through a window, or your web browser and Qgrid are acting as a window into the actual data frame. And this is kind of showing like you're only seeing a subset of the data frame at a time. So it's kind of a silly image, but hopefully helps you kind of remember how it works. So just really quickly, I want to go through some of the new capabilities that were unlocked by 1.0. The first is that you can explore much larger sets of data. And that's because of the scalability issues that were associated with sending large amounts of data down to the browser in Qgrid prior to 1.0. And just an interesting point on this, this actually can, when combined with pandas, can actually act as like a powerful CSV viewer / editor. A lot of spreadsheets have trouble with large CSVs, so Qgrid is an option that can handle the large CSVs pretty easily. Okay, I think I've gone through the other points here, and then I also mentioned this function already. GetChangedDF allows you to get your data frame back after applying sorts and filters or edits, and this actually enables this enables people that don't know pandas to use Qgrid to make changes and then get their data frame back. So believe it or not, some people that were asked to use Jupyter notebooks and don't know how to use pandas, they would actually export their data frame to a CSV file, open it in a spreadsheet application, make their edits, then save it as a CSV file again, and then import it into their notebook again. So Qgrid allows them to basically skip that entire painful step. And then finally, this is one thing I haven't mentioned yet. Because all of the interactions in the UI are getting sent up to the server now. Means what we can do is we can call callbacks whenever certain events happen, so that other code in your notebook can react to actions that are taken in Qgrid. And the cool thing that this enables, which actually I did not expect to happen at all when I first started working on Qgrid, is that you can sort of use Qgrid as a remote control, which controls other visualizations in your notebook, like a matplotlib plot. Okay, and then this is the listing of all of the Qgrid events that are available in the via the events API. So you have viewport change, which is when the user scrolls, selection change, sort change. They're pretty self-explanatory, except for so filter dropdown shown is like when you show the filter dropdown, and then text filter viewport change. This is when you're scrolling through the dropdown of the text filter. And also I have listed here the names of the events that are actually getting sent from JavaScript to the server. So for each event that can be fired from the events API, there is a corresponding event that that's not exposed in our API at all, but internally this is the message that's getting sent from JavaScript to the server. And then finally, I want to point out that some of these messages that are getting sent from JavaScript to the server, you can actually, some of them actually are exposed through our API now, and it's not a JavaScript method, but it's these are Python methods that you can call to basically programmatically do the exact same thing that happens when someone takes an action in the UI. So we have a change selection method, we have an edit cell method, add row, and remove row. So that allows you to programmatically, through Python code, update the state of the grid. And that's going to be useful for people for, I think, the use case where you're using Qgrid as a remote control for other visualizations. And I'll get into that more. And then finally, in 1.1.1, as I just mentioned, we have new API methods for interacting with Qgrid programmatically after it's been created. And then we added column options and improved display for multi-index data frames. And the multi-index data frames we added when we made Qgrid available on Quantopian, because a lot of the data frames that we want to show on Quantopian are multi-indexed. Okay, so one more demo. So this demo is going to take place in JupyterLab, and the reason for that is that's a new capability that was added in 1.0. Previously, Qgrid did not work well in JupyterLab, and now it works consistently. So I wanted to show that. And also, the other reason to not do this in Quantopian is it uses some parts of IPy widgets, and it uses some parts of matplotlib that are not available on Quantopian. Specifically for matplotlib, you need an interactive backend in order to do the animation stuff that I'm going to show you. Okay, so first demo here is just to show you that Qgrid works in JupyterLab. So you can see this is our familiar data frame from the first demo, where we have all our different types, and you can see everything is working normally. Quickly, I wanted to show you column options. So this was the PR that was added most recently, and it allows, so there are two different attributes you can use, or arguments you can use to the ShowGrid method. Column options sets options for all columns in the grid, and then column definitions allows you to override those options for specific columns. So in this example, I'm setting all of the columns to be not editable, but I'm going to make 2 of the columns editable, and then I'm going to give give them each a tooltip that says they're editable or also editable. And then I'm also going to make the column E, which is the checkbox column, I'm going to make that one less wide, so because it's doesn't need as much space. So if we execute that, you can see if I hover over column A, you can see a not editable tooltip. If I hover over column B, you can see editable. If I double click on column A, nothing happens, I can't edit. If I double click on column B, I can edit. And then same with E, so E is editable, and you can see the tooltip, and I can click here and I can edit. Cool, so that was column options. Now for some more interesting stuff. Okay, so if we let's take our data frame that we just showed, and now let's create a matplotlib plot with it, a scatter plot, and these are just random numbers in column B. So I'm charting those random numbers along with their x values, and then I'm making a trend line to see like what the trend of these random numbers are. And obviously that's not something you would do because the numbers are random, but this is just kind of a proof of concept. So one of the cool things you can do with Qgrid with JupyterLab is you can pull a widget out into its own view. So if you go to create new view for output, and then you can dock this anywhere you want in the UI. So say I dock it over here. Let me close, make some more room here. Okay, so this is cool. Now so one of the things that's in this cell that I didn't mention is we have a callback that's listening for all events from Qgrid, and every time an event happens, we're going to basically redraw the entire plot. So the idea is any update in Qgrid should be reflected in this chart. So let's say, for example, we're curious about what happens if we change this this outlier here, the lowest number that's being charted. What happens if we increase that value? How does that affect the trend line? So I can sort by column B to find the smallest value, and let's say we edit this, and now you can see that point moved, and the trend line adjusted appropriately. Similarly, so another thing you can do here is you could just delete an outlier, delete any points, and see how it affects your trend line. So if I remove this row, you can see the point is gone. So that's kind of just a proof of concept to show you how Qgrid can be used as a remote control for another visualization. And actually, one more thing I want to show here is filters work here too. So, and what's interesting about this, I think, is you can filter your visualization based on columns that aren't even being used in the visualization. So as you can see here, I'm just checking things and seeing how it affects the outcome. Okay, so that's enough of that example. So this was using the events API, by the way. It uses the Qgrid on method, and we're passing in all here to say that we're listening for all events. Now, in the next example, this is just going to set up an output area that actually logs every event that happens in any Qgrid instance. So it's not particularly interesting yet, but just for now, I'm going to move it to a new view, and so that it's available. And as you can see, if I go up to a Qgrid instance and I take some action, every action that I take is logged in this panel. So now let's look at another kind of interesting example. This is going to use some pricing data from Panda's data reader. Actually, I guess it's using Yahoo's pricing data, which actually works in their most recent development version on GitHub. It doesn't work in the PyPy version. But anyways, so here's some pricing data. I rendered my Qgrid as usual. And now let's render this as a sort of pricing chart. Sorry, okay, so we have our chart here, and as you can see, there's an area that's highlighted. And so we can see this better. Let's move this to a new view. Let's just leave it, how about we just leave it on the bottom there? Okay, so this has just charted the pricing data, but we're doing something kind of sneaky here using the events API again. We're listening for the viewport changed event, and then when the viewport is changed, we're going to update the position of this green span. So let me show you what that looks like as we scroll. So let me move Qgrid. Another cool thing about JupyterLab is Qgrid can even be put into a different view. So we put Qgrid there, make it a little taller so we can see what's going on. Okay, so as I scroll Qgrid, you can see on the right the green area that's showing, the green area is being updated to reflect which rows are being shown in Qgrid. So the part of the chart that is highlighted are the same rows that are being shown in Qgrid, and this is getting updated dynamically. Although it looks like there's maybe something funky happened there because we have two highlighted areas. But anyways, that's I think that's basically what I wanted to show for the for that demo. And then just the last few things, since I know I'm kind of way over time here. So the future, and I wanted to go over some of the future enhancements that people have proposed and the ones that I think are appealing. So one of the most requested features, so one of the things that we need on Quantopian and would like to have on Quantopian is a static HTML view of the grid when the notebook is converted to HTML, because when we share notebooks to our forums, we convert them to HTML, and right now there's just a message that says Qgrid can't be displayed. So that's one thing that's high on my list. Then some other things are like, I've been preparing for this demo and using Qgrid more recently, I've noticed it's a pain to use this. The force, I didn't even mention what the force fit columns option is, but force fit columns option allows you to change whether all your columns are squished into the horizontal into the available space, or if a horizontal scroll bar appears. So basically, what I want to do here is add a GUI control, like a button or something, to make it easy to toggle that, but also probably some other stuff too. I think in general, our strategy has been, if there's a new feature, start by adding it to the API. We add it to the API first, rather than going directly to creating a GUI control, because it's cheaper to add it to the API than to build a GUI control. So I think kind of converting some of these useful API methods into GUI controls would be a valuable thing. Okay, so this is one of the next thing is one of the most highly requested features, which is support for panda styles and cell highlighting in general. That's definitely very high on my list. I haven't quite figured out how I'm going to do that yet, but I did start looking into it a bit. And then another one is adding support for grand total row, or maybe that could be specified by a user in the form of a Python callback or something that calculates the total row. And then even if it's not custom calculated, show some basic grid statistics like number of rows, etc. Another idea was allow rendering widgets within cells, which I think makes a lot of sense. Like you can imagine having buttons within cells that do things with other, or that change the state of the data frame when they're clicked. And then another kind of like usability thing was auto resizing columns to fit their content, which is kind of a hard problem. And I'm not quite sure how I would solve it, but I think that's an important problem for Qgrid because it's inconvenient when you generate a grid and the columns don't fit the way you want them to. And then other high priority stuff are, there's kind of like some maintenance items that I have in the back of my mind. One is just making the code base more contributor friendly, which is going to just require some cleanup of the repository and adding some comments and stuff, and maybe some more documentation on how things work. Because I think right now the learning curve is pretty steep for becoming productive in Qgrid because there's lots. It's fairly complex now with Qgrid 1.0. And then another thing is browser/integration tests, which is something I'd love to have, but also I'd point out that I've done pretty well without them so far, and part of the reason for that is because Qgrid 1.0 moved a lot of the code from the browser to the server, so we can test it in Python. So I'm sort of not sure when I'll get to adding that, but I think we probably should. And then finally, automating the build and publish step in some way. So yeah, just to recap what we covered, I think we kind of answered the question of what is Qgrid with the various demos. Why did we build it? And why are we still working on it? I think we kind of covered with the project timeline and the demos showing you the capabilities and also kind of the interesting stuff that happened in 1.0. And what can Qgrid do? We covered that in the demos, and then finally, what's next for Qgrid? I just went over that. Some of the more interesting ideas that that I have in the back of my head. So I think that is it.
Cool. Thank you, Tim. So we're going to move on to the Q&A portion. We've had a few questions come in already. If you have a question about Qgrid that you want Tim to answer, I would suggest sending it now through the GoToWebinar platform. And then, yeah, so we'll get started on those.
Cool. Okay. First question is, can you share a copy of Intro to Qgrid webinar notebook? Yep, I will absolutely do that. Let's see yeah, so that would be the that's referring to the Quantopian one. Okay, can definitely do that. It's really similar to the one that I've already shared, but there are some small tweaks, so I'll share that one on the Quantopian forums. Could Qgrid basically be considered a Python library? No, because it's also contains a lot of JavaScript. So I moved a lot of the I converted a lot of the JavaScript into Python in Qgrid 1.0, but Qgrid depends on a third-party JavaScript library called SlickGrid, which was under development for a long time and is actually like a really impressive project. And I probably haven't given enough credit to SlickGrid over the course of this this presentation, but there's a lot of JavaScript code in SlickGrid, so I would say it's maybe like 50-50 JavaScript in Python. Okay, third question. Is it available only in the Quantopian platform now, or would I still be able to use it, say, in Jupyter Notebook? Yes, you can absolutely still use it in Jupyter Notebook. That is, we still want to keep the kind of separate open source project going. And in fact, we're a lot of the stuff that I've added, as I showed at the end, is really only useful outside of Quantopian right now, or I should say just the new stuff that I've added, as in like the use case of using Qgrid along with other visualizations is not really available on Quantopian yet, but it's something I would really love to make available there. What does message volume and sentiment values mean? Okay, so yeah, sorry, I didn't explain that very well. So those are columns that are coming from StockTwits. StockTwits is, let me just pull up the documentation here. So this is a data set that looks at the mood of traders that are posting on this this forum called StockTwits. And let's see. So I think, so message volume would be the number of messages that were on the, yeah, the number of messages that were posted to the forums, and then sentiment value is a score of the sentiment. Let me double check and make sure I understand how that's being calculated. So, oh, okay. So message volume is coming from the total scanned messages column, and then sentiment score is calculated as a simple moving average of the bull minus bear column with a window length of 7. So this is how it's calculated. So if you're interested in learning more about that, you can take a look at the notebook that I'm going to post. Okay, what's next? Is there an option to add columns in Qgrid? So the only way that you can add a column right now is you can actually just swap out the entire data frame. But that's the only way of doing it. But actually, one thing that I fixed recently is I made it so if you swap out the entire data frame, the Qgrid renders like really quickly, and actually it's not even really noticeable to you that it's been re-rendered. So that makes it so it's kind of practical to do this, and so that would be the only way to add columns currently. Is there a limitation on the max number of rows columns that Qgrid supports? No, there actually isn't. I mean, the only thing you're limited by is basically the memory constraints of your notebook server. So basically, if you can hold the data frame in memory on your notebook server, then Qgrid can show it. And also, I guess a caveat to that is like, if it's really slow to sort your data frame on your notebook server using pandas, then it's also going to be really slow to sort your data frame using Qgrid. For someone learning pandas, can Qgrid be used as a way to check their work? For example, make sure I'm getting the correct results. Yeah, that's actually a good use case. And one of the things that sort of an idea that I kicked around for a while was the idea of actually outputting every pandas command that Qgrid is taking, so that you could actually see which pandas commands correspond to the various actions that are taken in the notebook. So in that way, it would sort of turn Qgrid into a learning tool for pandas. But I'm not sure if that's going to happen. Can you plot a Qgrid, or would you use the pandas data frame? No, you would use the data frame. So, and you can always get a copy of your data frame back from Qgrid using GetChangedDF. So if you had a plot, for example, that you wanted to keep in sync with the data frame that Qgrid was showing, you could use the GetChangedDF method, and I think that was actually what I was using in the in this demo, or in the matplotlib demo, where we're just updating the plot in response to every event that happens in Qgrid. You can see here I'm using the GetChangedDF method to get the latest state of Qgrid back from the widget so that I can plot it. Let's see what's next. Why can't you programmatically change filter and sorting? It's a really good question. The answer is I just haven't implemented it yet. So basically okay, so you actually can, and it's just not documented in the API yet. What you can do is you can look at the messages that Qgrid's JavaScript sends to the server, and then you could send those same messages via Python. And so that would probably work, but this is also something that I intend to add to the API. But to start, I just started with the most requested methods that people wanted in terms of programmatic changes, and edit cell and change selection were kind of like the most requested ones. Will it perform calculations on columns such as mean, standard deviation, etc.? So that's kind of like the grand total row. Well, if you're talking about like showing the results of those calculations at the bottom in like a grand total row, that's kind of like the grand total row feature that I was talking about, which I'd like to do at some point, but it's not. I don't have it like on a schedule or anything. But if you're talking about having like another column that is made up of just calculated values, that Qgrid wouldn't do that. You should just do that with pandas for now, probably. Will the features shown in JupyterLab make their way to? When will the features shown in JupyterLab make their way to Quantopian? So all the Qgrid code is in Quantopian. What's missing is we need an interactive plotting library. So matplotlib was one is the one that I used in the demo here, but there's actually some other ones that are pretty good too. So we kind of have to figure out which interactive plotting library we want to make available in Quantopian. And I think that's the main thing that's blocking us from doing this sort of stuff in Quantopian. And then also the other feature that you don't have on Quantopian yet is all the JupyterLab stuff. By that I mean like the docking and being able to like pull the output of a cell into a different pane. That's going to be a bigger project because that requires making JupyterLab available on Quantopian, which I think we've talked about a bunch, but we don't have a plan for that yet. So the long story short is I can't really tell you when. I can just kind of give you an idea of how big those two projects are. But I will say, if you're excited about it, ask about it in the forums, or make your voice be known, because that will help us to increase the priority of that change. Unrelated to Qgrid, but what is your favorite feature in JupyterLab? I would say the docking, only because it enables so much for Qgrid. As I was showing before, like I think it's really powerful to be able to have Qgrid shown alongside another visualization and have them interacting in various ways, and that really was hard to do in the notebook because it's all linear and you can't put things side by side. You've exposed SlipGrid options directly to the user. Do you think that may make it harder for you to swap out SlipGrid with other JS grid library in the future? Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it would make it slightly harder. The reality is, I don't expect us to swap out SlickGrid because it's pretty unique, and that would sort of require, and also we're not only because of the SlickGrid options, but just because of like so much of the code base depends on SlickGrid, it would be like kind of like a complete rewrite, I think, if we switched the JS grid library. So that's kind of why I've been okay with exposing those options, because I think it's kind of unlikely that we'll do a full swap of the JS grid library. Okay, and that is the end of the questions.
Yep, that's all the time we have. So if you do have a question about Qgrid that we didn't get to, you can email us at support or post it in the forums. Our next webinar is going to be a tear sheet review with Dr. Jessica Stouth on July 26th, and you can register on Quantopian.com. And thanks everyone for joining, and thank you, Tim, for a great presentation.
Thanks.